Thank you so much. We have a really interesting tapestry of voices this morning, public sector and private sector. This is called American Success Stories, so we want to make sure that the stories you hear are replicable, scalable across America. This is all about jobs, and as you heard from Dr. Porter, we want to make sure that we take advantage of bottom-up economic development, and that's why success stories across America are so critical. So what I want to do is start by asking a question of those here who are representing the public sector, and I want to ask them if they could give an example from their region of a success story that worked to create jobs, looking at their strengths economically from their region. So you got a new one? So I'll start with you, Mayor Villaraigosa of Los Angeles. I know he's got some great stories to tell, and he was just elected as the president of the National Conference on Mayors as well. So we're glad to have you here this morning.
Well, thank you, Governor. And thank you for correcting the voice of God. It's Villaraigosa, and you did that perfectly. First of all, let me kind of set the table a bit. I represent and I'm mayor of the city of Los Angeles. And if you took Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York, just to understand the size of the economies of those metropolitan areas, they would be roughly the size of the fifth largest country in the world, GDP-wise, roughly the size of France. If you took the 10 largest economies in the United States, 10 biggest cities, and their economies, they would be a $5 trillion nation. Approaching the size of the only two countries bigger than that are the United States and China. When you think about that, investing in cities, investing in regions is critical to the future of America. It's the place where you could get the biggest bang for the buck. When you look at the metro economies today as an example, we generate about 90% of the GDP, 94% of the new jobs. So, your question about what have we done locally that we can actually take nationally, let me share with you. In the middle of the recession, we were looking at our infrastructure, the fact that LA is the city of gridlock, and I don't have to tell you, also a city with poor air quality. And we talked about what we could do to make investments in that infrastructure. We went to the people of Los Angeles and we convinced them to invest a half penny to generate $40 billion for infrastructure investment in the LA County area.
It's a citywide vote.
Countywide
vote.
Countywide vote. We needed 2/3 of the vote, and we got 67% of the vote. What was important about that, it was an investment in our freeways, our roads, and light synchronization, in public transit. The people voted overwhelmingly for this half penny sales tax, had support from the business community, labor, the public health groups, the environmental groups. That initiative will double the size of our rail system and make the kinds of investments that the state and federal government should be partnering in, but heretofore had not been. Now, what will that do? It'll create about 500,000 direct and indirect jobs over a 40-year period of time. Well, you know the way voters are. Almost immediately people said, well, where's that subway you promised me? Where's all these light rail lines? And of course, my response was this was a half penny sales tax, not a 10-cent sales tax. And so we started thinking about what we could do to accelerate that investment. We went to big thinkers about what innovative financing tools were available for us to be able to accelerate these programs. We found out there was a transportation loan program called the TIFIA program, very underfunded, $122 million. It provides a 30-to-1 match, or 30-to-1 leverage rather, and it would reward cities and counties who are putting up their own money to be able to bond against that money, get a loan, repay it back, and at a time of high deficits and debt, really leverage infrastructure investment. We now have John Mica, the chairman of transportation, Senator Boxer, Ray LaHood, the Obama administration, Ranking Member Imhoff, bipartisan support for increasing that TIFIA program to $1 billion.
Has it happened, or it still needs to happen?
It's been proposed, they support it, we got to get it through. But what's critical about that, and another initiative that I think Rahm Emanuel talked about yesterday, where you use an infrastructure bank, get the money, the repatriated money from corporations that are overseas to fund it, bipartisan support for that idea, to invest in infrastructure. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, we have a $2.1 trillion need. China's investing 3 times what we are and helping to pay for Europe. So that initiative alone, we're now calling it America Fast Forward, can generate 1 million jobs across the country. Locally, 166,000 jobs in a 10-year period of time. A great way to put people to work, but also make the investments in infrastructure locally and in our regional economies, which are critical to the nation.
So the private sector was a big support in this.
Big supporters.
Chambers of Commerce and others.
The bond companies, because we'd have to bond against this.
Can't do it, right, unless you've got public and private support for something. Great examples of those who have engendered public and private support are the governors of Colorado and of Indiana. I wonder, Governor Daniels, whether you can say a word about what you found and led in Indiana that would have created jobs as an example that we can take across the country.
Well, I'm always bashful about prescribing what worked in one piece of America to anywhere else, let alone to America at large, but I think there are some lessons. The boundaries of growth for any state are set by national policy, which can be either very helpful or very harmful, but as we've all learned in the last few years, there's nowhere to hide from a recession as deep as the one we've been in, unless you're lucky enough to sit on a lot of oil or gas. But the Indiana approach, pre and post-recession, hasn't been any different. We're out to create, we always say, the best sandbox in America, the most inviting, welcoming, low-cost, low-barrier climate anywhere for investment. We don't try to outguess the market. We know we have some long suits, industries which are naturally attracted to our part of America. Advanced manufacturing, we're the most manufacturing-intensive state in the country at present. But our goal always has been to align every agency of government and every law we can rewrite in the direction of lowering the cost, therefore improving the likelihood that somebody, men and women of enterprise, can come to Indiana and bet a buck and have a chance to get it back. So yes, lower taxes, but just as important, speed and predictability of regulation. We measure everybody in Indiana state government, and more often than not, or as often as possible, those metrics are based on their department's contribution or their individual contribution to making it more likely the next job comes to our state, not somewhere else. So, permitting time, we've driven down as far as we've wiped out permitting backlogs. Everybody knows that if the Economic Development Corporation, our public-private or our nonprofit job search engine calls, doesn't matter what else you're doing, that request goes to the top of the heap. Now, I'll just say lastly, and just to agree with something the mayor said, there's a very important active role for government, and infrastructure is a perfect and a very timely example. We're in the biggest building boom in Indiana state history. We're catching up an enormous backlog of roads and bridges and rail investment that had been deferred in the way broke public sector governments tend to do. And in our case, it's a little different. Yesterday was the 50th anniversary of the biggest public-private partnership in American history by a factor of 2. And that's the, if you count it correctly, $8+ billion deal for the Indiana Toll Road, which we have a private concessionaire operating the road. We have the best toll road we've ever had, and we got $4 billion of cash, no borrowing, no taxing, every penny of which being reinvested in the long-term assets for our state. So we were building roads, that had been on the drawing boards for years that are really important to future commerce, especially if you sit, as we do, at the crossroads of America. Two-thirds, by 2015, two-thirds of the substandard bridges that we were worried about will have been repaired, and on and on. So we just don't think government, at our level at least, has any higher calling or duty than to try to structure arrangements in every way possible to make it more attractive and more likely profitable for businesses to come and invest and then throw the doors open.
You just said in the back too, and you referred to active government as distinguished from big government, right? You want to have an active strategic government. And one of the things that you tried to do because of your manufacturing intensity was to diversify as well. Was there a strategy associated with that diversification? For example, did you select sectors that you knew would be your strong suit in consultation with business, for example?
I would say we didn't do more than guess. And then again, we don't try to outsmart the market. But we knew we had a head start in certain other areas like life sciences. We did try to rearrange public policies to be more conducive. So for instance, we've given credits for venture capital formation, and we have, within the limits of prudence, begun to invest from our pension funds, at least on a fund-to-fund basis. We were way behind in the amount of available capital. We've got the highest R&D tax credit in America now at the state level. So things like that that had certain sectors in mind. But a good example, Governor, is that we knew we had already a certain core in life sciences. We never included in our target list IT, but out of nowhere, Metro Indianapolis now has been measured as having I think the second fastest growing software and IT community in the country. We didn't know that was coming. But the new arrangements, the pro-investment arrangements we made happened to apparently be of use to the people we hadn't suspected.
Yeah, that's great.
Governor, could I just interject from a private sector standpoint? I like one of the things the governor said in a phrase that he used, and that's he wants to create an environment where people want to come, and if they bet a buck, they can get more than a buck back. And from our perspective, while UBS is a big company, we actually think the 20 million jobs that need to be created in this country, because we lost 7 million in the financial crisis, and we have 13 or 14 million people coming into the workforce between now and 2020, that it's going to be small business and entrepreneurs that drive it. And this partnership between government and business to do that the governor references, I think that's a big way that we do that.
I think we all agree that small businesses are a huge opportunity, and I know that there's a few on the panel who have a word to say about that, and perhaps you can describe that a little bit further as well. I'm just curious about Governor Hickenlooper, who comes from, new governor, but comes from the position of having been the mayor of Denver and did such a great job there, and especially fostering not just big business or not just strategic sectors, but small business as well. What would you say, though, from your perspective, has been the most effective policy or partnership that others can take away from your example?
Well, first let me just, it's great to be back in as Carl Sandburg said, the city of broad shoulders, and to be with one of the great governors in the United States and one of the great mayors. As an ex-mayor, present governor, I'm kind of sandwiched between talent. We did a lot of infrastructure stuff. The city, we worked with our suburbs, and we're able to get all 32 mayors in metropolitan Denver, Republicans and Democrats, big city, downtown, and small little towns like Foxfire, to unanimously support a 0.4 cent sales tax increase back in 2004 to build 119 miles of new track. I mean, that kind of collaboration, I think, is going to be critical going forward. I think collaboration is in many ways the new competition. But the two things I'd like to just briefly touch on are not so much directly about jobs, but they're about creating the talent for jobs. One was, we have a local couple in Denver, Tim and Bernie Marcus, that helped us create the Denver Scholarship Foundation so that we can go in, when I would go in and visit public schools in Denver, and I made a rash promise in my first campaign in 2003 that I'd visit every public school in Denver. No one told me there were 151 schools. But we went into every one and we could say, I guarantee you kids, about 75% of these kids are free and reduced lunch. If you work hard enough, money won't keep you from going to college. Tim and Bernie Marcus donated $50 million to create this ability to really incentivize kids at every level to work a little harder. And now we're seeing, after 4 years, that the persistence rate of these kids, the first group of 80 of them are just graduating or entered the program. 60 of the 80 have graduated in 4 years, and their persistence rate is 10 points. It's 81%. The state average is 71%. And we see now in the Denver high schools, the number of kids getting passing on their AP tests has gone up 40%. The number of kids choosing, in Colorado you can choose to go whatever school you want to. The attendance in Denver public schools, high schools, has gone up 50%. All from this kind of catalytic incentive that, we were the convener. We put together the Scholarship Foundation, but it was really the private sector and philanthropists that have funded it. And then the other thing, we've really worked hard on homelessness in Denver. We've cut chronic homelessness by 75%. A lot of that has been trying to make sure when you get someone off the streets and into housing, you get them into job training immediately, and you work with the business community to give them the special context where they can stay and work. And we put together a program 4 years ago called One Home, One Congregation, where there were 1,100 congregations of various faiths in metropolitan Denver. We had about 1,400 homeless families. So we were able to match up each congregation. We've now had about 325 congregations raise the down payment and first and last month's rent, but also put together teams of 5 or 6 mentors to work with these homeless families. And usually it's a single mother, but sometimes single, or even 2 parents, but sometimes a single father. But that mentoring for the first 6 months, where you've got 4 or 5 or 6 people from a congregation working with that homeless family, making sure they get to the job interview, making sure that if their car breaks down, they can still go to work, working with the employer to make sure they get a little special effort, has kept the percentage of families staying in housing, the persistence level there at more than double. And I think that, again, government didn't do that. We convened it, but we got funding from the private sector. We had the faith-based community stepping up, and we're able to, at some point as we work out of this recession, we need to look at how are we going to expand our workforce and make sure that they're ready, obviously for high-tech jobs and the higher-paying jobs, but also for call centers and various other jobs where we're just going to need more people.
So Mayor Hickenlooper has talked about the talent side of the equation, and particularly in communities that may have some barriers. Tony Hsieh is the CEO of Zappos, and has a remarkable story and has been able to attract incredible talent because of his leadership. And I'm sure he's got a story that could be replicated if we had other entrepreneurs like you, but he's also got a story of public-private partnerships.
Yeah, so I'll start with the first one. Just to give some background, we started in 1999, and the company grew from no sales to over $1 billion in gross merchandise sales in 2008. And despite the down economy over the past few years, we've actually each quarter been growing 30 to 40% year over year. And so a lot of people ask us, what have we been doing differently over the last few years? And it's not actually about anything that we've done differently over the past few years. It's about what we've always been doing, what we did prior to that. And for us, our focus is on customer service and company culture, which are two things that a lot of companies actually, those are the first things that companies cut when times get bad. And for us, those are our number one investments. And our whole philosophy is that if we get the culture right, and we've made the Fortune Best Companies to Work For list for the last 3 years in a row, then most of the other stuff like delivering great customer service or building a long-term enduring brand or business will happen naturally as a byproduct. So last year I wrote a book called Delivering Happiness, which was on the New York Times bestseller list for about 6 months, and actually talk about research that's been done. And some of it we initially stumbled on accidentally at Zappos just through trial and error, but talk about research that's been done on companies, and the researchers looked at what separated the great companies in terms of long-term financial performance from just the good ones or mediocre ones. And they were actually kind of surprised by their findings. They found that the great companies had 2 important ingredients that the good ones or mediocre ones generally didn't have. The first ingredient was that the great companies all had strong company cultures. And the second ingredient I actually found really counterintuitive. The second ingredient they found was that the great companies had a vision that had a higher purpose beyond just money or profits or being number one in market or beating their competitors. And the irony of that is, by actually having a higher purpose that wasn't about profits, it actually enabled these companies to generate more profits in the long term than their peers and competitors. So somewhat counterintuitive, and that's kind of how we've approached things at Zappos, is really focusing on customer happiness and employee happiness and having this higher purpose that is, for us, it's about delivering happiness to the world, and hence the title of the book. The second part is something we actually just announced about 6 months ago. We're taking over Las Vegas City Hall. The city's going to be moving into a new city hall, and it's actually in this area of downtown Las Vegas that most tourists don't know about. You know, most tourists, when they think about Las Vegas, think of the Strip, or for those that may have been to the Fremont Street Experience downtown, the old casinos and the overhead light show. But on the east side of Las Vegas Boulevard, which is within a couple blocks of where City Hall is, there's actually this area that's just starting to develop. There's coffee shops and bars and lounges, and if you go into those places, you would have no idea that you're in Las Vegas. You'd think you're in San Francisco or Austin. And so we've actually partnered with this guy named Richard Florida, who wrote several books about the creative class, has done research on hundreds of cities, see why some cities are thriving and some aren't. And basically, we're taking the research from that and research from other places to basically help rebuild a city from scratch and build a real sense of community and a real sense of culture in probably the place that's, you know, at least brand-wise, is the antithesis of all that. And so there are things from the research like bringing a live music scene and an art scene, and we're working to create a tech community, and so already there's a tech library that's in the works. This past weekend we just launched a competition called Startup Weekend, where companies had 48 hours to basically prototype a project, and then some of those will get funding afterwards, and also looking into things like building urban gardens and farming and so on. And so all of these things are happening at the same time. And there's things that you may not think about, like shorter sidewalks that actually contribute to developing a real sense of community and so on. And so that's basically our project for, you know, the next at least several years. And that's something where it's a partnership between Zappos and the local businesses and the city of Las Vegas.
So what would you advise Mayor Villaraigosa or either of the governors about what, if you were them, what would you do to replicate the sandbox that you have been able to create in Las Vegas, which is in the desert, so it kind of works?
Well, it's funny you use the word sandbox, because the analogy we use is that, you know, like there's a video game called SimCity where you get to build. It's a video, anyways, and so. And so we've talked about this is how this is like getting to play SimCity, but in real life. And so one tagline we've come up with is from Sin City to Sim City. And but really, I think the advice I would give is just make it easy, to do what we want to do. You know, historically, I'm of the belief that in general, much more innovation comes from the private sector than the public sector, and so just create an environment and create regulations or get rid of regulations so that really entrepreneurs of all sizes can, if they're passionate about something, can just make it happen without having to go through a lot of red tape, without having to go through, you know, this whole long process.
Are there examples, though, in Las Vegas of red tape that you had to go to City Hall to delete, to somehow remove so that you could do what you needed? I mean, you're going to City Hall, but you're not going to the people in City Hall since they've moved. How did you remove the barriers to be able to get that to happen?
Well, for that one, we got lucky. We just happened to know people that knew how that whole world worked. But if I didn't have those relationships...
You had consultants who knew how to interact with the government types?
Right, and so, you know, I don't know what's involved. You know, I don't pay much attention to politics, local or otherwise, and so...
What? Come on!
We're busy building other stuff, and so... So they help me avoid a lot of the extra work and navigation, but even so, if we want to put up, say, a new building to house a technology center from scratch, I'm told that's 3 to 6 month process to get that happening, and I don't know what's going on during those 3 to 6 months, but there's just lots of permits and
Governor
stuff
Daniels.
going on.
Well, just the word of reinforcement for what Tony just said, I'll just give you an example. In 2006, we deregulated telecommunications in Indiana. We didn't want the cable TV experience replicated where people had to go around and kiss a ring in every community and hire a lot of people. And one stop, one permit, and go to work. And there's been an explosion of investment. Really important to a place like us. We've got a lot of towns. To some of them, this modern infrastructure, fiber and frequency, is more important than the traditional, or as important as roads and bridges, were the terms in which we used to think. So I'll just report that we discovered 2 or 3 months ago that out of nowhere, I don't know where we were before, but it wasn't a proud place, Indiana now has the third fastest average broadband speed in the country. And so making it easier, particularly if others haven't yet done that, for people to, and companies large and small, to get quickly into business. I tell our people all the time, time is money is not a figure of speech. It's a literal equation. And so, there's one rather fresh experience we have that worked more rapidly than I frankly imagined it would.
I think speed to market is such a critical thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess one of the best phrases, I didn't come up with this phrase that I heard in the best way. It's not just about speed to market. It's basically about how do you increase the metabolism of a city or an organization. And part of that is speed of market, but just any place there's bureaucracy or something that takes time, you're slowing down the metabolism of that place.
Right. In fact, I think if there's any piece, as a former governor, of advice I could give to people is if you could go through and do a value stream mapping process of all of your permitting, get rid of the ones that are anachronistic, just take them off, put everything else online, make it one button, as Governor Daniels said, it's the easiest way to be able to, slick the path for entrepreneurs. So we're talking about entrepreneurs, and Tanya Fiddling has been doing incredible work in the Native American community. Maybe you can say a word about your experience both on the public and the private side.
I would start by saying that we're creating private sector on reservations, and I think that's a good point to qualify the environment that we're working in. And between the public and private and our tribal governments, our sovereign nations that are there for the service of the people to provide infrastructure and development, but they've also been bearing the burden of economy too. So we're trying to create economy through private sector, Native tribal citizen private sector in the last 10 years that I've been running the Community Development Financial Institution on Hsieh River. And we are making great strides, I would say. We haven't had access to affordable financial capital, predatory lenders, stock reservation communities, or banks and non-reporting banks that don't allow us to build credit histories in Indian country become barriers for folks that are looking to start businesses or grow any kind of wealth or assets in Native communities. So the wonderful opportunity we've had as a CDFI, and this is across the country, there's about 60 Native CDFIs in this movement that's only about 10 years old, that have been supporting entrepreneurship development. And especially on our reservation, we've got about 50% of our population is under the age of 25. So we've been ramping up in the last 5 years efforts that focus on developing financial capability and entrepreneurship in our school system, which means we've integrated those concepts into the core subject area, K through 12. And there's a lot of really neat programs out there, mainstream programs such as junior achievement and that kind of thing. But I'm coming out of Ziebach County, Dewey and Ziebach County. Ziebach is currently the poorest county in America, yippee. And our community and the grassroots people have a different vision. I'm glad Tony referred to vision, that it has to be about more than just profit for communities. It has to be about something larger, broader. I believe regulation has to be that ethical place that we lay out how to conduct business. So with that, the engagement we've had with kids and tribal members, investing in them with affordable financial products that allow them to, set off their passion. Nobody's asked for many, many years in Indian country of individual tribal citizens what their passions are. It's almost that we become afraid to dream in Indian communities because of the despair and everything else that's going on. So entrepreneurship for Native America is almost like a cultural revitalization where the risk-taking, the wisdom, all the things that you need to be cutting edge and compete or provide products and services within the community, there is this communal component that Native peoples, that's how we operate, not who's the best at the top of the pile, but how do we serve and advance all folks in our places. And I wanted to say, by the way, we have clean air and wonderful things in rural, and I have to get it out there before the panel closes that I know job creation is coming from the metros, but what do you do with the 70% of the rest of America that's rural? We have value out there, and in these places that we can create opportunities. Folks are coming into regionalism. We're connecting throughout South Dakota with other states, giving our entrepreneurs opportunity. We've got a fellow that's up in Timberlake, South Dakota, has created a compound bow company called Lakota Archery. He's also running manufacturing and Department of Defense contracts in the middle of nowhere, creating jobs left and right. Or, kids that have created jobs for themselves because how can you come out of poverty if there isn't meaningful work? 75% of the jobs in America are coming from self-employed sole proprietors, not just corporate. So investing in people, investing in developing human capital, and a lot of this is just introducing some of these concepts, translating economy and the national business environment into something that our people understand. And once they get the tools, we do some analysis of the gaps, the products and services that are missing in local economy, or help launch them up to the next level of contracting and those kinds of things. They're hungry for it. So we're responsible for creating hundreds of jobs, changing our school system. Because the poverty is so chronic and persistent, we've had to go at it systemically, which our tribal governments are in support of. I think the state of South Dakota in general and other rural places could benefit from an approach that informs and educates. We translate things like consumer confidence index, what is confidence to Lakota people, and it's the word is wechia, and it's to explain the consume and contribute dynamic, because we can't be over here in solely consuming resources and everything else around us, but also what do you give back, and how is that exchange between the business, the government, and the individual consumer, the customer at the end of the day. We're creating those dialogues locally, replicated throughout Indian country through our networks of native CDFIs. So I think it's an exciting time, but there has to be a patience with us because this is new. On Cheyenne River, it's a new dynamic.
Yeah.
Actually, I just want to follow up on her comment about passion. Sometimes when I speak to entrepreneurs at conferences, I get asked sometimes, okay, by an entrepreneur, what's a good market to go into where I can make a lot of money? And my advice to them is actually, instead of having money be your primary motivator, think about what would you be so passionate about doing that you'd be happy doing it for 10 years, even if you don't make any money, and that's what you should be doing. And the irony of that is, if you do that, it will actually greatly increase your chances of making more money. And the reason for that is because your passion is what's going to get you through the tough times, and every business has its ups and downs, and your passion is going to rub off on employees, have this ripple effect onto customers and business partners and so on. So my advice for entrepreneurs is, chase the vision and what you're passionate about, and not the money, and the money will end up following.
So a lot of what we've heard today is, so far, and Dr. Porter, my next question is to you, is really how government can help to grease the skids for passion for those private sector entities to be able to fulfill what they hope is. It's so interesting to me that you, Tony, for example, you have to hire people to do that ugly stuff of dealing with the government so that you can focus on where your passion is. And what we'd like to do is to not have to have you do that. You'd like to be able to do it without having to hire folks to deal with government. A lot of what we've talked about is playing defense on the part of governments. How do you clear the way for others? And I'm wondering if there is a role for government that is more on offense, where government can be more strategic in identifying sectors, for example, that it should be playing in to create the environments we're talking about. And Dr. Porter, you've obviously done a huge amount of work in clustering and in working with the private sector and the public sector to create those local economies. You talked about it a little bit. But what would you advise, especially sitting mayors and governors, about strategic offense, economic planning that they could engage in a way that's successful?
Well, I think the first thing I would advise is humility about strategic planning in government. I think what we know very, very definitively from all the data that we have and all the experience around the world is that actually your greatest odds of success are really to build on the strengths you already have. Your odds of creating some entirely new field because you dream that you want to be in biotech is pretty low. But if you have an existing presence in medical devices and you can build on that presence and put more assets in place and get the private sector in that field working together with government to identify gaps, to identify constraints, to fix the regulations that are standing in the way of that particular field, to figure out what infrastructure is missing or inefficient, what permits are not relevant anymore. If you can kind of collaborate around the areas where you have some critical mass, where you have some unique strengths, that's your first order of growth. And then what we find is something very, very interesting. We find that the way economies diversify into new fields, ironically, is almost always related in some way to the fields they're already in. So if you're in chemicals, you have a much higher odds of success if you move into plastics than if you try to get into aerospace. Because by having that chemical expertise and those technologists and those engineers and those facilities and those suppliers, you have some unique assets that you can use to get into the next field and the next field. So what we find is that the new high-tech fields often grow out of the established fields. It'd be very interesting to look at the IT case in Indiana and see exactly what that IT is, because I would bet that it's connected to the assets that were there.
What's the most successful government intervention, if you will, to be able to build on those strengths? So you've got an established IT sector, established biotech sector. What should the public side do to increase the likelihood of more of that coming?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing it should do is if that group, and we call these clusters, if a cluster isn't organized, the first thing the government can help do is convene those companies and those institutions to start the process of collaboration and creating their own agenda for progress. I think kind of the second thing the government needs to do is listen and figure out what the obstacles are and figure out what the problems are and the constraints are and the weaknesses are and the skill gaps are. We know that training doesn't work if you're just training people. Training works when you connect it to the needs of a particular field. Government doesn't need to create the training programs. The private sector will help create them, but you got to organize it around those areas where you've got a group of private sector companies in a field collaborating together. And then sometimes government has to make investments. Sometimes government has to put infrastructure dollars in place, maybe some R&D resources in the local university. So government has a multifaceted role, but ultimately it's all about the process of unleashing the kind of stuff that Tony was talking about. This entrepreneurship, the sense of opportunity that people have, that they can build the next company, the next company, the next company.
To kind of follow up on what Michael was talking about, we've had a very robust clean tech sector in Los Angeles. But over the last 6 years, we've taken our utilities, the largest in the United States of America, to 20% renewables, the only one in the country. We recycle more trash, 65% than any city in the country. Our Clean Air Action Plan at the port, and our port moves 44% of all the seaborne goods into the United States. It's the largest port complex in the United States. Is the most far-reaching effort to clean up a port. We've leveraged all of that, and with Caltech, UCLA, and Hsieh, created a clean tech corridor, an innovation fund at the port, where we're creating new innovations, new technologies that we can export, and creating jobs here in LA. And importantly, we're connecting workforce development to that. So whether it's solar installations or other green tech jobs, we're training the workforce for these new jobs. So it's a way to leverage academia with the private sector, with technology transfer, and creating new jobs and workforce development.
Yeah. So I'm going to have to respectfully disagree with the original premise, at least from Las Vegas' perspective, because what Las Vegas has always been good at has been the gaming business, casinos, and construction. And we focused more and more on that and became overly dependent on that. And what we're actually focused on now is building a real tech and startup community, which has nothing to do with gaming and has nothing to do with construction. And our approach is actually look at different cities and areas where there are strong, there's a strong startup community, strong tech community, so places like San Francisco or Austin, and then look at what type of environment they have that actually attracts the type of employees that want to, type of people that want to work in startups and tech companies. So, if you go to Austin and if you go to San Francisco, there are things like coffee shops or tea lounges, or walkability and live music and so on. And so that's what we're working on.
You're not talking about tax incentives, though.
We're not talking about tax incentives. We're talking.
It's all about talent and place.
It's about creating a place where the people that you're trying to attract actually want to live.
Even if it's more expensive.
Even
if the business finds it more expensive to do work there.
I'm not sure.
Meaning, even if your tax rate is not the lowest in the country, you are identifying places that have talent rather than tax rates that are favorable.
Right, and we actually moved our business from we were in San Francisco for the first 4 years or so, and we moved from San Francisco to Nevada, and people say, oh, it's because of the tax, no state tax and so on. But it wasn't because of that. It was because that was going to be the best place for us to grow our biggest department, which is our call center.
Not all businesses, I bet, would say that. I'm curious what your customers are telling you about.
I would say a couple things. I'm going to make myself unpopular in the room because I'm going to disagree with Tony. I think passion has its place in business. I think it's important. But I think it's very important for the people that leave this conference to go out with ideas that can be put into place. And the idea that passion alone can carry you forward does not match up with my life experience. I'm passionate about what I do. But delivering a profit on a consistent basis is what allows you to create jobs. This man does that as well.
I'm not saying I'm not saying that that's alone. And in fact, the subtitle of my book is A Path to Profits, Passion, and Purpose. And what research has shown is you actually need all three in order to build a long-term, sustainable, growing business. And I think too many businesses focus on just the profits part of it, either forget about or don't care about the passion and purpose part of it, and that actually ends up hurting their ability to generate more profits in the long term.
Well, you clearly are passionate. I also think, though, that what a number of the panelists have referenced is the idea of creating a culture. What the mayor described a second ago is creating a culture in Los Angeles about how his government's going to work with business. And if you said to me, Governor, what is the best thing that business can do, what the public sector can do, is creating that culture on a micro basis, because I think the United States economy is actually a patchwork of smaller economies. What we're trying to do with our initiative that President Clinton talked about earlier is most of the good things that have happened to me in my life and most people I know is because of access to education. You have a number of entrepreneurs in our country, and some in small communities like you referenced, that they have a certain amount of success, but then they run into the roadblock of growth and they can't create nearly as many jobs as they could. So we're going to take a combination of our employees, our clients, and our intellectual capital. We're going to run a beta test in the New York area and then roll it to Chicago eventually, where we will take our financial advisors who will provide the financial literacy and education to entrepreneurs who have shown a track record. Our clients, most of our clients actually are people first generation wealth. Many of them are business owners, and they want to give back and help. So you take your financial advisors, your clients, and then within our company we have a global perspective and capability, and we know what's working around the world or have a view on it, and we can contribute that as well in the way of workshops. We think that this growth, you have 64% of the jobs in the last 15 years have come from small business. 40% of the payroll is coming from small business. A combination of bigger businesses working with government who create the culture that the mayor and the governors allude to, and then with the education and intellectual capital. We can be a great country and a job engine once again.
Here's my challenge, though, and I speak from the former governor of a manufacturing state, is that we're competing with China, we're competing with other parts of the world who are not afraid to be more aggressive than the United States has been with respect to partnering, if you will, with business to make them successful here in the United States. Tony, you're not thinking at the moment about moving overseas because you've got all of your passion, profits, and purpose aligned with you here, but I bet a lot of your competitors might contemplate moving overseas where they can get more of a profit because it's cheaper to locate somewhere else, or because the governments somewhere else are not as beholden to laissez-faire economies as we have historically been in this country. And so I am constantly struggling with how active can government be, and I use the word active in a way that doesn't describe a big government, but one that is strategic in helping businesses to be successful in America.
I think in our country, if government provides the sandbox, as Governor Daniels said, for people to compete, that the ingenuity, the education, the creativity of Americans wins. That doesn't mean, I don't mean to be Pollyannish about it. It doesn't mean that that China and places like that aren't a competitive threat. It doesn't mean they're going to continue to progress. But we think that the United States still is the leading country. And we still think that the ingenuity and creativity that made this country great is in place today. And if government just provides the sandbox for the natural creativity and entrepreneurship that exists within this country, we'll do fine.
You know, one thing that government can also do is help people believe, and really you talk a lot about culture in businesses. I mean, each city, each state has a powerful culture. I think one of the things that Antonio's done remarkably well in Los Angeles is get people to believe in their city again. We just finished what we call the bottom up. Now, I'm from the tavern business, so I didn't say bottoms up, but bottom up. Economic development plan where instead of the smart people coming into Denver and saying, all right, here's what we're going to do, we went out to all 64 counties in Colorado and asked people over the course of 4 months. We ended up connecting with over 10,000 people in multiple occasions. What do you need government to do? We are going to be pro-business. We're going to hold ourselves to the highest environmental standards. We're going to protect our quality of life, but we are going to be pro-business. And they talked about access to capital. They talked about more broadband in the rural areas. And they especially talked about red tape. We had over 1,000 specific suggestions of where do we need to cut process, where is appropriate regulation kind of gotten thrown aside and a bunch of red tape created. And I think that's the part. Now I think we have the beginning of people in Colorado believing, right? Really saying, all right, we can have a government that is pro-business and trying to help us.
So I know we've only got 3 minutes left in our panel, and Tanya, you want to get a point in?
Just
and
real quick,
yep.
to speak to getting out in the communities, getting the feel for, because these are the places of development. and government's role to be inclusive of, poverty communities, challenging, awful. Let's go over here to the place where it's more fertile. However, the work that we're doing, it can be evidenced in data. I'm glad data came up in South Dakota that the economic momentum index of 2 of our largest reservations is 2 to 3 times the economic momentum index for the state of South Dakota in general. How do you attract investment into communities if the story is over and over what the deficits are, but it has to be about the assets, the strengths, the opportunity that's there. And our reservations should be the places with these 2 to 3 times economic momentum of South Dakota, where our state looks to do some development and partnering. So I do think that's an important role of government, is to identify opportunity such as that.
So this panel has been about partnerships. It's been about tearing down barriers to being able to unleash the passion of the private sector. And I think Dr. Porter has been very eloquent in the need to be humbly smart as governmental entities in partnering with the private sector. Just quickly, I want to end on this because I do think there's great hope in all of this. If we aren't afraid to have government partner with the private sector and decide as a nation that we will allow bottom-up strategies, that we can have an environment which allows for local communities to make decisions about who they're inviting in based upon their strengths, then I think that this patchwork that is America will be a phenomenal, robust economic patchwork. And I will leave you just with one story from Michigan. In Michigan, we've had the toughest economy in the nation for the past decade, the highest unemployment rate in the nation. And when the auto industry imploded, we had to do, and before then too, we did some very serious economic strategy planning with our private sector. And we decided that we knew we had this great strength in the auto industry, but we also wanted to be the place where the next auto industry was built, in addition to diversifying, auto industry 2.0. And so we decided that we were going to partner with those who wanted to produce the battery for the electric vehicle. And in the space of a year and a half, with the federal government's assistance through the Recovery Act, we were able to attract 18 companies to Michigan who are promised to create 63,000 jobs between 2010 and 2020 to create the drivetrain for that electric vehicle. It would not have happened were it not for a partnership between the private sector and the government. I think that in a 21st century, we can't be afraid to have strategic, bottom-up partnerships between the private sector and government, and we have to do it if we're going to compete globally. Thank you all so very much for coming. Thank you all, audience, for listening. On to the next panel.